Hi everyone, welcome to this video on the history of Noxus. This is a follow-on to my Noxus Will Rise video earlier this week, so check that out if you have not already. And real quick before I start, the only real calendar we have access to on Runeterra is the Noxian Calendar, with year 0 representing the birth of Noxus as a nation. Any time before this is represented with a BN for before Noxus, and any time after that is represented with an AN for after Noxus. Present day is around the year 1000 AN, I think it's 996 AN, but let's start with the ancient history of Noxus. In the year 400 BN, the spirit of a long-dead warlord named Sanazal called out into the material realm. He promised power to any of those who would listen, and he was eventually heard by a coven of sorcerers seeking to wield the warlord's strength for their own. The warlord's body was no more, so the sorcerers instead bound his spirit into a huge set of dark metal armour. The warlord rose stronger than any living mortal and began to slay the sorcerers who had summoned him. They screamed his name in an attempt to bind him, but Sanazal was no more. His soul had become twisted in the realm beyond, and the spirits had given him a new name. That name is Mordekaiser. Mordekaiser spent 300 years terrorizing the area of Valoran and raised a dark fortress called the Immortal Bastion at the center of his empire. To most, this was simply a seat of power, but to Mordekaiser and his closest allies, it was a secure location to hold forbidden knowledge of spirits, death, and of realms beyond. Mordekaiser would fill his Immortal Bastion with these secrets until he was eventually destroyed by an alliance of fierce barbarian tribes known as the Noxii, who had united against Mordekaiser. Through the combined might of the Noxii tribes, as well as a betrayal from a pale woman within Mordekaiser's own court, they defeated the Dreadlord, and he was cast out of the world that he had come to terrorize. The triumphant Noxii took the Immortal Bastion as their prize and began to push its borders outwards as a method of defending itself and acquiring much needed resources. This continued for 100 years or so until conflicting Noxii nations acquired the World Runes, fragments of the raw magic that was once used to shape the world from nothingness. The rival Noxii nations used these runes against each other, tearing the world apart, and in just 10 years, the world had radically transformed, with civilizations and entire land masses being destroyed. In the end, those who wielded the world runes all but destroyed one another, and the modern world as we know it was born. Many of the Noxii had retreated inside the Immortal Bastion during the Rune Wars, and when they emerged, they did so as a single people. This was the birth of Noxus, marked on their calendar as year 0. The Noxians, as their proud Noxii ancestors before them, pushed their borders outwards with relative success until the year 892, when they encountered Demacia, who not only resisted their invasions, but drove the Noxians back. In response to this, Noxus sent in Scion, one of their greatest warlords, and upon arrival found an exhausted army that was more than ready to give up and let Demacia keep the land they had taken from them. Scion was outraged by this and killed the Noxian commander for being too weak, and then charged at the Demacians with his warband. The Noxian army did not follow, however, and Scion was quickly surrounded. Despite this, Scion kept fighting and eventually traded his own life for that of the Demacian king, Jarvan I. Scion's body was recovered, but the loss of such a great warlord had some ramifications for Noxus. Demacia began to liberate many of the countries in central Valoran, freeing them from Noxian rule and returning them to the people of those nations. It took around 50 years, but this partnership between Demacia and the various nations in central Valoran pushed the western border of Noxus back to near the capital. In an act of desperation, the Emperor, Borum Darkwill, employed an order known as the Black Rose to resurrect Scion, who at this point had been dead for around 50 years, and whilst the ritual was successful, Scion was no longer himself and was fueled almost entirely by rage and bloodlust. Proving to be completely out of control, Emperor Borum Darkwill ordered for him to be imprisoned. It took hundreds of Noxian lives to restrain Scion, but he was eventually locked away under the very statue that had been raised to honour him half a century earlier. The Black Rose that I just mentioned is a secret order led by LeBlanc, who has a similar description to the pale woman who helped overthrow Mordekaiser some 1,000 years earlier. LeBlanc orchestrated several plots to overthrow Emperor Darkwill, and then anonymously leaked information on those schemes to Jericho Swain. Jericho dealt with the threat as any Noxian general would, with swift and brutal executions for everybody involved, including Jericho's own house, House Swain. Several Black Rose members, including LeBlanc, were also executed by Swain in this time. The important takeaway here is that Jericho believes LeBlanc to be dead. In the year 984, Emperor Boram Darkwill orders an attack on Ionia. Darkwill had become paranoid and unhinged in his old age, and sought a method of extending his life beyond a normal human lifespan. Ionia is a place of natural magic, where its people strive to live at peace with the world in separate self-governing communities. There was neither a central government nor standing army in Ionia, so the initial attack by Noxus was devastating. The Ionians lost one of their most holy sites, the Placidium of Navori, with many of its magical artifacts being shipped back to Noxus for its deranged emperor. This unrelenting focus on recovering artifacts caused Boram Darkwill to ignore the warfront, and Jericho Swain was left to defend the Placidium with a tired, hungry and weakened force. By this time, the Ionians were beginning to organise themselves into a resistance, transforming their previously peaceful practices of martial arts and dance into weapons of war. Eventually, Swain was overrun by the Ionian resistance, with a 14-year-old Aurelia shattering his knee and cleaving through his left arm entirely. The battle was lost, and as Swain lay on the precipice of death, a raven approached and granted him a vision of a great evil back in the heart of Noxus. In this moment of clarity, Swain realised that LeBlanc was still alive, and that Emperor Darkwill was being controlled by the Black Rose from the shadows. Now, there is a lot more to this war, but many of the central characters are actually Ionian, so I'll save that story for another time, focused on Ionia. The only thing I will quickly mention before moving on is that Noxus ended up using chemtech weapons against Ionia, which we'll see the impact of a little bit later on. The Raven had granted Swain a second life, but it was too late. He was disgraced and removed from the military, heralded to all as a mere cripple. The Raven led Swain to the darkest parts of the Immortal Bastion, where he gained the power of an ancient demon and began to plot the fall of Emperor Boram Darkwill, who by now was nearing complete madness. Swain used his skills in diplomacy to gather support from key Noxian nobles, including Katarina's father, and when the time was right, took the Noxian Empire away from Darkwill by murdering him in the year 989. By this time, the Ionian War had been on for roughly 5 years, and Aurelia had built a resistance capable of standing toe-to-toe with the invading Noxian force. Swain, who was now the new Emperor of Noxus, felt the campaign was unwinnable in its current state, and pulled most of his troops out of Ionia, only holding on to a few territories near the coastline. Shortly after coming to power, Swain abolished the position of Emperor in favour of the Trifarix Council, a selection of 3 individuals who would rule Noxus together, each representing a principle of strength and keeping each other in check. I spoke about the council in my last video, so I won't do that here. The Argent Mountains have been in a messy state since Sion's death, and somewhere between the years 989 and 996, Prince Jarvan IV of Demacia took note of this and decided to liberate the area of Noxian rule. Prince Jarvan took the Gates of Morning with ease and continued to march further into Noxian territory. Noxus responded to this invasion by sending Darius and his newly formed Trifarian Legion to the Gates of Morning. The Demacian troops that were stationed there were completely wiped out by Darius, and Prince Jarvan found himself cut off from Demacia, deep in Noxian territory. Perhaps due to inexperience, Jarvan continued to push forward even further into Noxian territory, and it didn't take long for his army to be found and defeated by the Noxians, with Jarvan only just escaping into the wilderness with an arrow in his side. He eventually collapsed, death seemingly imminent, but he was found and saved by a woman with purple skin. This woman was Shyvana, and she took Jarvan to the safety of Renfell, a fortified settlement on the Demacian border. Noxus had lost its opportunity to kill the Demacian prince, but had at least reasserted their presence at the Gates of Morning, giving them a launch point into Demacian territory should they need it in the future. Just going off script for a second, there's plenty of evidence in the lore to say that Jarvan and Shyvana are romantically involved, or at least were, and I think that will probably play into the story of Demacia in the future. But for now, this video is about Noxus, so let's stay on topic. Noxus manages to insert 2 War Mason spies into Piltover, who attempt to get accepted into House Medardar, one of the most influential houses in Piltover, by posing as junior inventors. Before the test begins, one of these spies, Tamara, realizes that she is compromised after she sees Caitlin searching for someone in the crowd. Tamara intentionally fails the entrance test and draws the attention of Caitlin onto herself, allowing the other War Mason to successfully infiltrate House Medardar as a spy for Noxus. Tamara, however, is cast out of Piltover by Caitlin and is next seen helping Darius with the rebellion of Basilich. Basilich is a port town in eastern Valoran and the birthplace of Darius, Draven and their childhood friend Quill, who Darius later had a romance with. Darius, Draven and Tamara lead a siege on the city to bring it back into the fold and engage in negotiations with Quill. Quill refuses to surrender, explaining that Noxus demands too much from its people and that she has nothing left to give. She lost her right arm in the first Ionian invasion, and later on she lost her 2 children. During this discussion, several ships of soldiers appear on the ocean from Vindor, another port city further down the coastline, but it's unclear whose side they're on. We know that Vindor was, at the very least, intending to rebel against Noxus alongside Basilich, but Darius claims that that is no longer the case and that they're actually here to help Noxus. Quill believes this to be a bluff, but before we can discover their actual allegiance, Quill is murdered by her second in command, ending the rebellion and the comic. What's clear is that certain towns and cities in Noxus may not be happy with the current regime and are willing to rebel if they feel they can. Swain has released Scion from his imprisonment so that he can lead the charge in a second invasion of Ionia. This time, however, Ionia seems to be a little bit more prepared, with Aurelia, Akali, Yasuo, Karma, and even Kennen ready to push the Noxians back. Although it must be said that the Ionian force do not look particularly well trained, and mostly wield what look to be pitchforks and other farming tools. Compare that to the Noxian soldiers, and it's not too difficult to see why the Ionians had such a hard time with Noxus the first time around. But that's all we know about the conflict so far. We believe that it started, or at the very least is soon to start. The events of this is shown in the Awaken cinematic, which are confirmed to be canon, but the timeline of those cinematics are a little bit up to interpretation, so it might very well that this hasn't actually begun yet, and it's something to come in the future. And that brings us to the modern day. We don't know how the Second Ionian War is going, or whether more city-states are planning to rebel, but it's safe to say that these will be plot points explored by Riot in the future, hopefully in the MMO. There's a ton of possible stories they can explore from here, but we'll save that speculation for another video. I want to keep these lore-style videos focused and informative, without me rambling on for half hour about how Mordekaiser might be a few years away, or, LeBlanc is the third principle of strength, things like that. I'll put those in their own videos. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. So once again, thank you for watching. I appreciate you being here, and I'll catch you next time.